This story is titled, My Parents Wanted to Give My Share of Inheritance to Their Favored Daughter, but Little Did They Realize What Was Coming. Hey everyone, I just wanted to share something real with you. The channel's been slowing down a bit recently, and honestly, I put a lot of time and effort into finding these stories to keep bringing you the best content. If you enjoy what I do, it would mean the world if you hit that subscribe button. Your support really makes all the difference and keeps this journey going strong. Thanks so much for being here with me. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Hey Reddit, I guess I'm just venting here, but maybe someone will relate. My name's Jordan, and I've spent my whole life feeling like an afterthought. It wasn't always obvious to me when I was younger, but as I got older I realized my parents had a favorite, and it wasn't me. My younger sister Chloe, 25 now, was always their golden child. I'm 28, and while you'd think the whole sibling rivalry thing fades with age, the truth is, when favoritism is this blatant, it leaves a mark. Let me start from the beginning. When I was 5 and Chloe was 2, we both had birthdays that year, obviously. My parents threw Chloe this ridiculously over-the-top party. I'm talking bouncy castles, a petting zoo, face painters, and even a clown. They went all out for her. I can still remember sitting on the lawn, eating some cake and petting a goat, but what stuck out the most was when someone asked me, Wow, do you think you'll get a party like this for your birthday? And I said, No, mine already passed. Yeah. For my birthday that same year, I got a store-bought cake from the grocery store and a family dinner at home. That's it. No big deal, right? But even as a kid, I noticed the difference. It set the tone for everything that came after. Chloe always got the best of everything. She had the newest toys, the cutest clothes, and most importantly, my parents' full attention. Me? I was told to be patient, share, or just deal with it. One time, when I was around 10, I saved up my allowance for months, to buy a new bike. It was my pride and joy. The day I finally brought it home, Chloe saw it and decided she wanted one too. She started crying and throwing a tantrum. Instead of teaching her about saving up or waiting her turn, my parents went out that same weekend and bought her an even better bike than mine. That moment stuck with me. It wasn't about the bike itself, it was the message. My hard work didn't matter. If Chloe wanted something, she got it. End of story. School was another battleground where the favoritism became impossible to ignore. I was the straight A student, the one who stayed up late studying, joined clubs, and genuinely tried to excel. My parents barely noticed. Meanwhile, Chloe was the kind of student who coasted through school, barely scraping by with C's. But if she got a B on a single test, oh, my parents would lose their minds with pride. They'd take her out for dinner or buy her something as a reward for her hard work. One time, in 4th grade, I got the lead role in the school play. I practiced for weeks and was so excited to perform. My parents promised they'd come and cheer me on. The night of the play, they showed up an hour late and missed my big scene. When I asked what happened, they said Chloe had a tummy ache and needed comforting. Later, I found out she was fine. They just lost track of time playing with her. I wish I could say this was a one-time thing, but it wasn't. High school was even worse. I threw myself into everything I could, hoping to get some recognition from them. I was captain of the debate team, editor of the school newspaper, and maintained a 4.0 GPA. My parents barely noticed. Chloe, on the other hand, spent most of her time hanging out with friends and partying, but my parents still treated her like she was the star of the family. One of the worst examples happened during my junior year. I was selected as one of 2 students from my school to attend a prestigious summer program at Harvard. It was a huge honor, and I was thrilled. I shared the news with my family at dinner, expecting at least some excitement. My dad grunted and said, That's nice, before changing the subject to Chloe's upcoming dance recital. My mom at least said, Good for you, but she was already pulling up pictures of Chloe in her recital costume to show everyone. Here's the kicker. My flight to Boston for the program was scheduled on the same day as Chloe's recital. My parents refused to drive me to the airport because they didn't want to miss her performance. I ended up having to ask a friend's parents for a ride. It was humiliating and hurtful, but at that point, I should have expected it. When it came time for college applications, I poured my heart and soul into the process. I spent months writing essays, studying for the SATs, and participating in every extracurricular activity I could. I ended up getting accepted into several top-tier universities, including my dream school, with a substantial scholarship. I remember announcing it at dinner, hoping for at least a little acknowledgement. My dad barely looked up from his plate and said, That's good, but don't let it go to your head. College isn't everything. My mom added, Just don't forget about us when you're off becoming a big shot. Meanwhile, when Chloe barely graduated high school and decided not to go to college. My parents praised her for knowing herself and not caving to societal pressures. They even bought her a car as a graduation present, something they never did for me. The constant favoritism took a toll on me emotionally. I struggled with depression and anxiety throughout my teens and early 20s. By the time I started college, I realized I needed help and began seeing a therapist. It was eye-opening. For the first time, someone validated my feelings and helped me understand that my parents' behavior wasn't my fault. It took years of work to build my self-esteem and learn to validate myself instead of seeking approval from my parents. Despite the lack of support from them, I managed to build a good life for myself. I graduated college with honors, landed a good job in finance, and even bought my own house by the time I was 27. I'm proud of what I've achieved, even if my parents aren't. But their favoritism wasn't just a childhood phase. It followed me into adulthood, and it's still affecting our family dynamics in ways I never imagined. 3 months ago, everything changed when my grandfather, David, passed away. Grandpa was one of the few people in my family who treated me and Chloe equally. He never played favorites, not with his kids or grandkids, and he believed in fairness above all else. Losing him hit me hard because he was one of the few people who truly saw me. Grandpa built a business from the ground up, a small family-run operation that eventually grew into something pretty significant. Over the years, he made sure his kids and grandkids understood the value of hard work, but he also made it clear that he wanted everyone to have equal opportunities. When his will was read, it reflected that mindset. His estate was divided equally among his children, my dad, Ethan, and his siblings, and his grandchildren. This included me, Chloe, and our cousins. When I learned my share was $500,000, I was in shock. That amount of money would completely change my life. I could finally pay off my student loans, invest in my future, and maybe even start my own business like Grandpa had. At first, I didn't think much about how my parents would react. I mean, this was Grandpa's decision, and I assumed they'd respect it. Boy, was I wrong. After the reading of the will, my parents pulled me aside. They weren't excited for me or happy about the opportunities this money could bring. Instead, they were visibly upset. My dad started by saying, "This doesn't seem fair." I was confused and asked what he meant. He went on to explain that Chloe needed the money more than I did. Their reasoning? Chloe still lives in their basement and works part-time at a coffee shop. According to them, she's struggling to find her footing and deserves a little extra help. They argued that since I already had a stable job, a house, and no major financial issues, other than my student loans, it would be the right thing to do for me to give my share to Chloe. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to stay calm and explain that this wasn't my decision to make. It was Grandpa's. His will was clear, and he wanted all his grandchildren to be treated equally, but they wouldn't let it go. My dad said, "Do you really think it's fair for you to have all this money when your sister is struggling?" I was fuming inside, but kept my cool. I told them that while I understood they wanted to help Chloe, it wasn't fair to expect me to give up what Grandpa had left me. That's when the guilt tripping started. My dad brought up every instance he could think of where they had helped me. He mentioned paying for my braces when I was a kid, which, by the way, were medically necessary, buying me school supplies, and letting me live at home during college, even though I worked part-time and contributed to household expenses. He conveniently left out the fact that they bought Chloe a car, took her on countless shopping sprees, and still paid for everything she needed even as an adult. When I stood firm and said I wasn't giving up my inheritance, my dad's tone shifted. He said, "If you won't do the right thing, I'll make sure this is handled properly." That's when I realized how serious this was. My dad was the executor of Grandpa's will, and he was implying he'd take matters into his own hands. A few days later, he confirmed my worst fears. He announced to me, and the rest of the family, that he was going to reinterpret Grandpa's wishes. He planned to give Chloe my entire share of the inheritance on top of the share she was already getting. His reasoning? Grandpa would have wanted Chloe to have more if he'd fully understood her circumstances. I was devastated. This wasn't just about money. It was about years of being overlooked and undervalued. I felt like I was being told, once again, that my hard work and achievements didn't matter. At this point, I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I reached out to my grandmother, Linda, for advice. She was furious when I told her what was happening. Grandma had been married to Grandpa for over 50 years and knew exactly what his intentions were. She said, "This is absolutely not what David wanted. Your father has no right to change the will." Grandma didn't just stop at being angry. She took action. She contacted her lawyer and got in touch with the other executors of the will. She also looped in my dad's siblings, who were just as outraged as she was. Grandpa had even added a clause to his will specifically to prevent situations like this. It stated that anyone who contested the equal distribution of assets would forfeit their share entirely. When I confronted my parents with this information, they were stunned. My dad tried to backtrack, saying he was just trying to look out for Chloe's future. My mom, Megan, chimed in with, "You're blowing this out of proportion. This should have been handled in-house. Why involve everyone else?" I reminded them that Grandpa had always treated his grandchildren equally, and that he'd been fully aware of our situations when he wrote the will. That's when my mom accused me of speaking ill of the dead by suggesting Grandpa wouldn't have wanted what they were proposing. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Chloe, for her part, stayed mostly quiet during all this. When I tried to talk to her privately, she just shrugged and said, "Mom and Dad know best. I didn't ask for this." I didn't know whether to feel angry or sad. It wasn't her fault that our parents had spoiled her to the point of being completely dependent on them, but at the same time, I wished she'd stand up for me. Just this once. Thanks to Grandma and my dad's siblings, the will was ultimately upheld as written. My dad was removed as an executor due to his clear conflict of interest. I got my share of the inheritance, but the whole situation left a bitter taste in my mouth. My parents were furious. They accused me of turning the family against them and causing unnecessary drama. My dad even threatened to cut me out of their own will entirely, to which I replied, "I never expected anything from you anyway." That comment seemed to hit a nerve, but I didn't care. It felt like the final straw in a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter. But as much as I wanted to move on, the fallout from this situation was far from over. After Grandpa's will was upheld, I thought the worst of it was over. I had my inheritance, and I naively believed my parents would back off after being legally forced to follow Grandpa's wishes. I was wrong. The fallout was just getting started, and it ended up being one of the most stressful times of my life. First, let me explain how my parents reacted. My dad, Ethan, was furious about being removed as an executor of the will. He accused me of conspiring with Grandma and the rest of the family to humiliate him. He said, "You don't know what you've done. You've ruined our family's reputation." I remember staring at him, trying to process how he could possibly see himself as the victim in all this. My mom, Megan, took a different approach. She leaned hard into the guilt tripping. She said things like, "I don't know how you can sleep at night knowing your sister is struggling while you're sitting on a pile of money." She brought up every so-called sacrifice they'd made for me growing up, conveniently leaving out the favoritism that had been shoved in my face for years. Chloe stayed quiet through most of this. I think she felt awkward about the whole situation, but she wasn't willing to go against our parents. When I tried to talk to her one-on-one, she just shrugged and said, "I didn't ask for this. It's between you and Mom and Dad." I could tell she was uncomfortable, but it still hurt that she wouldn't speak up for me. Then came the extended family drama. My dad tried to rally the family against me, spreading rumors that I had somehow manipulated Grandpa into leaving me money. He told anyone who would listen that I was selfish, greedy, and ungrateful. At one point, he even claimed that Grandma had brainwashed me into turning against the family. Thankfully, most of the extended family didn't buy into his narrative. Grandpa's will had been clear, and the clause about forfeiting shares if anyone contested the distribution shut down a lot of potential arguments. My dad's siblings were firmly on my side, and they weren't shy about voicing their support. They knew how hard I'd worked to get where I am, and how much favoritism my parents had shown Chloe over the years. But not everyone was supportive. A few cousins suggested that I should have just given Chloe the money to keep the peace. One of them even said, "It's not like you need it, right? You've got a good job and a house. Why not help your sister out?" That comment made my blood boil. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. Grandpa had made his wishes clear, and my parents had tried to twist those wishes to fit their narrative. Giving up my inheritance wouldn't have fixed anything. It would have just reinforced the idea that Chloe's needs and wants always come first, no matter what. The breaking point came about a month after the will was settled. My aunt, one of my dad's siblings, hosted a family gathering. She specifically didn't invite my parents because she wanted to avoid drama, but they showed up anyway. The tension in the room was unbearable the moment they walked in. My dad immediately started ranting about how I had betrayed the family and stolen from Chloe. He called me names and accused me of ruining my sister's life. My mom, ever the dramatist, threw an old photo album at my feet and said, "Look at all these happy memories you've destroyed." It was embarrassing, infuriating, and heartbreaking all at once. I didn't know how to respond. Thankfully, my aunt and a few other relatives stepped in and told my parents to leave. It turned into a shouting match, and eventually my dad stormed out, dragging my mom with him. After they left, I sat there feeling numb. I hated that it had come to this, but I also knew I couldn't keep letting them control me. For the first time, I realized just how much their favoritism had shaped my life, not just in terms of missed opportunities, but in how I saw myself. I decided to reach out to Grandma again. She had been my rock through this whole ordeal, and I needed her wisdom now more than ever. When I told her about the incident at the family gathering, she sighed and said, "Your dad's always been stubborn, but this is a new low. Don't let his behavior make you doubt yourself. You're doing the right thing." Grandma also shared something that completely changed how I saw the situation. Apparently, a few years ago, my parents had approached Grandpa and asked him to leave everything to Chloe in his will. Grandpa had firmly refused. He told them he believed in treating all his grandchildren equally and didn't want to create resentment within the family. Knowing that my parents had tried to manipulate Grandpa during his lifetime made their actions after his death even more infuriating. It also gave me a sense of validation. Grandpa had been clear about his wishes, and I wasn't going to let anyone twist them. Armed with this new information, I confronted my parents again. I asked them point blank why they thought it was okay to go against Grandpa's wishes. My dad tried to justify it by saying, "We were just looking out for Chloe's future. You'll be fine without the money." My mom added, "We didn't want to hurt you. We just thought Chloe needed it more." I wasn't buying it. I told them that if Grandpa had wanted Chloe to have more, he would have written the will that way. They didn't have an answer for that. The situation between us remains tense, but at least the legal battle is over. My dad was officially removed as an executor, and the will was executed as written. I got my inheritance, but the cost was high. I've stopped attending family dinners because I can't handle the cold shoulders and judgmental stares. My parents barely speak to me, and when they do, it's usually to guilt trip me or accuse me of causing drama. Despite all this, I feel a small sense of empowerment. For the first time in my life, I stood up to my parents and refused to be sidelined. It's terrifying and liberating all at once. But the emotional toll is real. I've started having anxiety attacks again, something I hadn't dealt with since college. I've been considering going back to therapy to help me process everything. This situation has brought up so many old wounds, and I know I need to heal if I want to move forward. The fallout isn't over, but I'm determined to hold my ground. Grandpa believed in me, and I'm not going to let his faith in me be in vain. Update 1 point. One night, I broke down and called Chloe. I told her how much it hurt that she wasn't standing up for me, even though she knew our parents were in the wrong. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "I didn't ask for this, Jordan. I never wanted to be in the middle of all this drama." "I know," I said, "but you're not in the middle, Chloe. You're benefiting from it. They've spent our whole lives putting you first and me second. And now they're trying to take something that Grandpa left for both of us and give it all to you. Don't you see how unfair that is?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she might actually agree with me. But instead she said, "I don't know, Jordan. I just want things to go back to the way they were." That was the last time I reached out to her for a while. I couldn't keep trying to fix things with someone who didn't want to see the bigger picture. But something changed a few weeks later. Chloe called me out of the blue and asked if we could meet for coffee. I was hesitant, but I agreed. When we sat down, she looked nervous. "I've been thinking about what you said," she started, "about how Mom and Dad have treated you. And you're right. It's not fair. It's never been fair." I was stunned. Chloe went on to say that she'd talked to Grandma and heard some stories about our childhood that she didn't even remember. She admitted that being the favorite wasn't as great as it seemed. "They've always done everything for me," she said. "Bought me things, bailed me out of trouble, made excuses for me. But it's left me feeling like I can't do anything on my own. Watching you stand up to them, it made me realize I want more for myself." Hearing her say that was like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I felt like she truly understood where I was coming from. We talked for hours about our childhood, our parents, and how their favoritism had shaped both of our lives in different ways. Chloe told me she'd decided to use her share of the inheritance to go to college. She said she didn't know what she wanted to study yet, but she was excited to finally take control of her own life. I couldn't have been prouder of her. It felt like we were finally starting to rebuild our relationship, not as rivals, but as siblings who actually supported each other. Of course, our parents weren't thrilled about Chloe's decision. My mom tried to guilt her into staying home, saying she was abandoning the family. My dad barely spoke to her at all, which hurt Chloe more than she let on. But despite their reaction, Chloe stood firm. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. Update 2.0. While Chloe and I were working on rebuilding our relationship, our parents were doubling down on their bitterness. Let me start with my mom, Megan. After Chloe announced she was going to college, My mom tried every guilt trip in the book to stop her. She said things like, "You're leaving us just when we need you the most." And, "College isn't for everyone, Chloe. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." It was obvious she didn't want Chloe to grow independent. She liked having Chloe under their control, where they could keep playing the hero by bailing her out whenever things got tough. But Chloe wasn't budging. For the first time, she was standing up for herself. And for me too, in a way. When our mom tried to bring me into her arguments, saying things like, "You're just following Jordan's bad example," Chloe shut her down. She told her, "This isn't about Jordan. This is about me wanting to live my own life." Hearing that gave me so much hope. It wasn't easy for Chloe to break free from our parents' hold, and I knew how much courage it took for her to take that step. My dad, Ethan, was a whole different story. He barely spoke to either of us after the college announcement. When he did, it was cold and dismissive. He told Chloe she was wasting her inheritance on school and said she'd regret it when she couldn't handle the pressure. For me, his anger turned into outright hostility. He started spreading more rumors about me within the family, claiming that I was corrupting Chloe and tearing the family apart. It hurt, but at this point I was used to his manipulative tactics. The breaking point came when my dad threatened to sell our childhood home. He called me one day out of nowhere and said, "If you and Chloe don't come to your senses, I'm putting the house on the market. Maybe then you'll realize what you're throwing away." I was stunned. The house wasn't just a piece of property. It was where we grew up, where we spent holidays, where so many memories were made. But I wasn't going to let him use it as leverage. I told him, "Do what you want with the house, Dad. I'm not going to let you manipulate me anymore." After that, I stopped answering his calls. Despite the chaos, Chloe and I started spending more time together. We made it a point to meet up at least once a month, just the two of us. At first, it was a little awkward. We weren't used to being this close. But as time went on, we started opening up about our lives, our childhood, and how we both wanted to move forward. One day, Chloe surprised me by saying, "You know, I used to envy you." I almost laughed, thinking she was joking. "Envy me? For what?" "For being so independent," she said. "For not needing them the way I always have. I thought being the favorite meant I had it better, but now I see it just kept me stuck." That hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd been angry at Chloe for benefiting from our parents' favoritism, but I never thought about how it had held her back. It made me realize that we were both victims of the same toxic dynamic, just in different ways. As Chloe started her college journey, I threw myself into making the most of my inheritance. I paid off my student loans first, which was a huge relief. Then I worked with a financial advisor to set up investments and savings for the future. But I didn't stop there. Inspired by the therapy I'd started during college, I decided to use some of the money to give back. I donated to local mental health organizations and even started planning a small scholarship fund for kids from families like mine, kids who needed a little help to break free from difficult circumstances. Through all of this, my grandma, Linda, was my biggest supporter. She reminded me of how proud Grandpa would have been to see me standing up for myself and using my inheritance wisely. She even shared more stories about him, how he used to brag about my accomplishments to his friends, how he kept a scrapbook of my achievements, and how he always believed I'd do something meaningful with my life. Those stories gave me strength. For so long, I felt invisible in my own family. But knowing that Grandpa saw me and believed in me was incredibly healing. Meanwhile, my mom was making small steps toward reconciliation. She started going to therapy at Grandma's urging, and after a few months, she reached out to me. She admitted that she hadn't always been fair and asked if we could talk. I agreed, cautiously. I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, but I wanted to see if she was serious about changing. We met for lunch, and for the first time in my life, she actually listened to me. She didn't try to defend herself or make excuses. She just listened. It wasn't perfect, and I'm still keeping my boundaries firm, but it felt like a step in the right direction. My dad, on the other hand, refused to budge. He still acted like he was the victim, blaming me and Chloe for the family's problems. He missed several family events because he didn't want to be in the same room as me, and when he did show up, he made sure to make his disapproval known. As painful as it was, I had to accept that he might never change. It wasn't easy, but therapy helped me come to terms with the fact that I couldn't control his behavior. I could only control my own. Through it all, I've learned so much about the true meaning of family. It's not about blood or tradition. It's about the people who truly support and care for you. For me, that's been Grandma, Chloe, and a few close friends who've stood by me through everything. I'm still working on healing from the scars my parents left, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm on the right path. I'm building a life that makes me happy, free from their toxic expectations. And honestly, That feels better than any inheritance ever could. You won't believe this. My grandma dropped a bomb, but it was like she was speaking in code. After they scooped up my super talented bro, my parents ghosted this place because apparently I was the dumb one they didn't want around. I'm here all on my own now, and it's like a ghost town. Can you even fathom it? Did my folks just straight up ditch me? My grandma, on the other hand, showered me with crazy love, mouth-watering grub, and the warmest, fuzziest smiles you could ever imagine. I discovered the true joy of being embraced for who I am. Then, after enjoying more than 2 decades of freedom, my parents suddenly reappeared in my life. They showed up after witnessing my success as a respected media researcher, but there was something sinister in their intentions, and they came at me with a sinister grin. I could feel a seething rage building up inside me as I watched their desperate actions, realizing they had brought this upon themselves. Seeing them with those wicked smiles, spewing insincere praises like, "You're incredible," or hysterically ranting about a daughter's duty to assist her parents was so nauseating that it left me speechless. My emotions boiled over, and my thoughts sharpened to a point. These individuals hadn't changed one bit. They think their values are the only ones that matter, using them to excuse excluding others and justifying all sorts of tyranny, without a care for the people they harm. It's laughable, really. Now they come to me solely because they need something. Well, I won't hold back any longer. I've been forging my own path in life, and I can't consider those who neglected me my whole life as family anymore. I feel no connection to them whatsoever. The moment had arrived to finally speak my mind to my parents. I disown any claim to their inheritance and officially declare our estrangement. I am Sarah, a 28-year-old researcher. Ever since I was a child, I adored playing outdoors, sprinting through mud puddles and digging in sand pits until I was completely covered in dirt. It all started when my science teacher began discussing microorganisms. The concept of something that you can't see but is still there totally blew my mind. Even though these things were invisible to our naked eyes, they each had these crazy different looks under a microscope. I was obsessed with uncovering things I'd never seen before. So I begged my parents to buy me a picture book from the store. But guess what? That still didn't cut it. We didn't have a microscope at home, and I couldn't always use one at school. Can you believe the level of disappointment I felt? My teacher started telling us about these incredible microorganisms, like how they chow down on fallen leaves and make their homes in mud. Since leaves in the mud were everywhere, I couldn't resist investigating. So I ended up covered in mud while exploring the fascinating world of these tiny creatures. "Sarah, why do you always mess up your clothes?" my mom would say. "How many times do I have to remind you?" Every time I returned home with my clothes all messed up, my mother would give me a piece of her mind. But you see, I tended to forget about her warnings when I was out playing, especially since she wanted me to embrace more traditionally feminine activities. She'd insist, "You're a girl, so put on a dress. Playing outside is just not something girls should be doing," despite the fact that I love the complete opposite kind of play. That's how I ended up getting scolded by her quite often. My habit of getting completely engrossed in things, to the point where I'd forget everything else, caused issues at school too. During home visits, my teacher would make remarks like, "Sarah often struggles to stay focused in class and can be caught daydreaming frequently. She gets distracted easily and loses her concentration." My mom would give an awkward smile, apologize on my behalf, and then gently say to me, "Let's work hard and study, dear." But as soon as the teacher left, she would grab my arm and unleash a high-pitched tirade. I couldn't help it. I found classes incredibly dull. The lectures were often a confusing jumble, with teachers spewing out information without any rhyme or reason. Just sitting there and listening became mind-numbing, and my thoughts would inevitably drift to more captivating topics. That's how it felt, and it's why my test scores were all over the place. I aced some tests with near-perfect scores while struggling to get even in the 20s on others. My inconsistency made my report card look like a roller coaster ride. At school, the teachers would encourage having interests, even if it meant putting varying levels of effort into them, rather than having no interest at all. But for my parents, having even one subject with less than stellar grades was absolutely unacceptable. They would toss my report card aside in utter disgust, muttering, "A fool has no place in this house." My parents were perpetually bragging about their own achievements. My mom, who taught at a fiercely competitive high school, held her head high for having graduated from a prestigious university with rigorous academic standards. She firmly believed that top-notch grades and getting into a prestigious university were the keys to a successful life. I couldn't help but notice that the people around her were somewhat put off by her unwavering values. It seemed like my mom either didn't notice or simply didn't care, even if someone dared to tell her. In the world today, The prestige of the institution you graduate from holds immense importance. Anyone who doesn't grasp that fact is seen as a sore loser. It might have been easier to handle if my mom had simply been condescending toward others, but she took it a step further and was confrontational with anyone who had a different viewpoint. So, to keep the peace, it was generally best to avoid any kind of conflict. My dad was quite similar. He had graduated from medical school and became a medical researcher, frequently discussing his work at the university hospital and publishing research papers. He held a strong conviction that a person's value was defined by their academic background, and he didn't hesitate to belittle patients and faculty from other departments based on where they had studied. In their eyes, my situation was embarrassingly unacceptable. Unfortunately, I had a brother who was the complete opposite of me. He was the ideal child, always obedient and excelling in school as per our parents' wishes. He enjoyed luxurious, nutrition-focused meals and high-quality clothing as rewards for his achievements. I was the complete opposite. My meals often consisted of leftovers from what my brother and parents had eaten. My clothes were either too small or hand-me-downs from my brother. When I began favoring outdoor activities over indoor ones, the chances of receiving new clothes dwindled significantly. Our parents treated my brother and me differently based on their values. However, I still loved my brother, and he was always kind to me. My brother had a mountain of workbooks and was always stuck at his study desk, as per our parents' demands. However, he still found the time to assist me with my homework and would even share his snacks, knowing that I didn't get any special treats. Both of us silently understood that going against our parents' wishes wasn't the smartest move. The lowest point came when I was 9 years old. With my parents consumed by their own work and my brother's education, they gradually started treating me as if I were completely invisible. My parents simply told me to fend for myself and stopped including me in the meals they prepared for themselves and my brother. They would lock me in my room, claiming it was for doing homework, and only let me out when my brother went to take a bath. Then, I would scrounge for whatever I could find in the refrigerator for food and wear whatever clothes were clean and available. My dirty, muddy clothes were frequently rejected, even when I tried to put them in the laundry, and they'd be left on the floor. Strangely, there would be a tablet placed nearby, playing a video on how to use the washing machine, and I ended up learning how to do my own laundry by watching those videos. I remember feeling a sense of relief when nobody commented on my self-sufficiency. There were days when I didn't see my parents at all. My parents were perpetually absorbed in their work, and on the rare occasions when they had time off, they dedicated it entirely to my brother. Even if we happened to pass each other in the house, there was no eye contact, no response to my attempts at conversation. So, gradually, I stopped trying to engage in conversation, and in response, my parents seemed to ignore my existence even more. They diligently read all the school handouts and provided everything I needed for school, but emotional connection and acknowledgement were sorely lacking, so I simply accepted that this was how things were meant to be. Perhaps my teachers, being colleagues of my mother, never imagined that she would take things to such extremes. There was never any communication or discussion about it. Then one day, when I returned home from school, I discovered a note on the living room table in our empty house. It simply said, "Your brother is going to a new school. We've made this house livable for you." At first, I couldn't grasp the message. I had heard from my brother himself that he might be switching schools, but it didn't seem definite at the time. Little did I know that my parents had already arranged everything. But as I read that note repeatedly, it slowly sank in that I was the one being left behind. My parents were going with my brother, leaving the house for me, and it felt like they were implying that they didn't need me. As I realized this, tears began to stream down my cheeks. I was overwhelmed with sadness, thinking it was all because I wasn't good at studying, because I didn't always obey because I got my clothes dirty. It was heartbreaking because no matter how hard I tried to earn my parents' attention by doing good things and behaving well, it never seemed to matter. Once I did something that they deemed wrong, I became invisible to them. Feeling abandoned was an unbearable sadness. I cried out loud, sobbing as the darkness settled outside, and I grew exhausted from crying. I began to think more clearly again. It was impossible for a 9-year-old child to live alone, even if I had a house. What about food and all the other basic needs? I was completely helpless without any money, and the thought of being all by myself scared me to death. But then, it hit me like a lightning bolt, a memory from my early childhood. I used to visit my grandparents all the time back then. They were my mom's folks, and I'd stay over at their place quite frequently. My grandma, who worked as a caretaker at a foster home, used to take me there with her sometimes. There were many kids my age, and I'm sure we played together. I think it was the year before last. My grandfather passed away, and my grandmother started living alone in that big house. At that time, my mother and grandmother had some kind of falling out, and I stopped going to my grandparents' house or see my grandmother. My grandmother was alone too. With that idea burning in my mind, I embarked on a frantic hunt for my grandmother's contact details. All I could recall was my mother's maiden name, which was also my grandmother's last name. Armed with just that tiny piece of information, I scoured every nook and cranny of the house in a desperate quest. Finally, after a thorough search, I stumbled upon an old handwritten contact book tucked beneath the landline phone. And there it was, my grandmother's last name and her phone number. I had never made a phone call on my own before, but it felt like grasping at a lifeline. I frantically punched the numbers from the contact book, but then I realized I had to lift the receiver for the call to actually go through. After fumbling 3 times, I finally managed to lift the receiver, pressed it to my ear, and dialed the number. I could hear the ringing tone, and after a few rings, the line clicked, silencing the sound. My heart raced as I uttered the words, "Yes, hello, Grandma, it's Sarah." She immediately recognized it was me, and right there on the phone, I managed to explain the situation I was in. Then Grandma said, "I'll come right away," and hung up. Soon after, she came to pick me up in her car when she saw me, as I opened the front door to greet her. She seemed to catch her breath. She must have been shocked by my shabby appearance, but I was too filled with relief to care. There she was, the kind grandmother I remembered right in front of me. I was so happy. I just threw myself into her arms. "Your beautiful hair and your clothes," as she hugged me tightly. Grandma said, stroking my hair. Her touch was so gentle. Those words from my grandma filled me with an overwhelming sense of relief. "Come on, grab what you need, and let's head to my place," she said, giving my back a comforting pat. She was taking me in to live with her. "Yeah, Mom and Dad. They're not coming back, are they?" I hesitated for a brief moment, feeling as though leaving this house would truly cut the last ties with my family, despite all the tears I had shed over feeling abandoned. But still, there was a part of me that was clinging to hope. "I'm just a silly girl they didn't want." "Well, isn't that good?" Grandma said. I didn't understand what she meant by that and looked up at her. "You're free now, Sarah. You're free. What do you want to eat? I'll make it. What do you want? What do you want to do?" Free, of course. We'll have some basic rules since we'll be living together, just to make sure neither of us feels bad or has a hard time. Okay? Yeah, apart from that, you're free. Do lots of things you like. Have fun. That's what you can do now. Her words warmed something inside me, being free to have fun. I wasn't quite sure what that life would be like, but an exciting expectation was growing inside me. Afterwards, I moved in with my grandma and started attending a new school. It was a serene, rural area where my grandma resided, and the school was small with only a handful of students. Perhaps because of its size, being the new kid was seen as something novel, and everyone treated me kindly. The teachers were attentive to each student, and I no longer faced the scoldings I'd endured before. "Sarah, you have things you like. That's great. Research the things you're interested in. There should be books in the library, but remember, balance is important. Pay attention in class, finish your homework, then you can do lots of things you like." Everyone accepted me. They helped me when I didn't understand something. They didn't deny who I was. I think before I was never really seen for who I am. But now they just naturally accepted me as I am. So I started to smile a lot more. And near Grandma's house. It was like a treasure trove for me. It was a place where ancient fossils and buried forests have been discovered. And although no major excavation work was being done now, remnants must still be there. Above all, I wondered what kind of microorganisms had lived and worked in that land. I had so many questions and curiosities brewing within me. I wondered about the effects of different layers of the earth and what they were like. Did different creatures inhabit each layer? I was hungry for knowledge. Every day in that rural setting, I'd see people covered in mud, running around and exploring every corner. Once, driven by my curiosity, I started digging and stumbled upon something resembling a fossil, sending my excitement through the roof. Each day was an adventure, brimming with discoveries and a sense of fulfillment. I naturally came to think that this was something I wanted to continue doing for a long time. 20 years have passed since my parents left me behind. Now, at 29, I'm working in a research job specializing in biology raised by my grandmother. After high school, I went on to college for 4 years to earn my bachelor's degree, followed by a master's and doctorate totaling another 4 years. I successfully defended my doctoral thesis and attained my PhD, landing a job at a well-regarded research institute right out of school. Right after taking me in, my grandmother somehow got in touch with my mother and insisted she pay for my education and upbringing. Naturally, my mother was reluctant, but Grandma threatened to consult child services. the police, and hire a lawyer to sue her if she didn't fulfill her obligations. Worried about their reputation, my parents begrudgingly transferred the bare minimum amount of money to my grandmother. Of course, that wasn't enough for tuition, so I used grant-type scholarships and honor student programs to complete my studies as quickly as possible. Now I'm working on things I've always been interested in, like fossil excavation, understanding the conditions and age of the land. My life became incredibly fulfilling. Despite the reputation of research institutes for their demanding hours, often exceeding 100 hours a month, I didn't distinguish between working hours and overtime. I conducted my research driven solely by my insatiable curiosity, using a variety of methods to uncover answers. It felt like there was never enough time for the sheer joy of learning. While some colleagues had left unable to endure this environment, I found the job to be thoroughly enjoyable, devoid of any hardship. Being nicknamed a physical and mental powerhouse at work is something I take as a compliment. Having been denied the chance to do what I wanted and my feelings negated in the past, I relish the opportunity to delve into my interest and make new discoveries in this job. Since childhood, I've been intensely interested in one thing, which often became a target of criticism from adults. But now I can use this trait effectively in my work. My grandmother helped me learn how to manage this trait, turning it into a strength that I could use as my weapon. As a result, I understood how to study efficiently, improving my grades. I did well in my entrance exams and could fully utilize this trait in my research. I thrived on organizing and prioritizing multiple tasks in my mind, methodically tackling each one. The feeling of my brain working at full tilt, almost boiling over as I delved into information and unearthed answers, brought an indescribable pleasure. It was becoming increasingly clear that this job was a perfect fit for me. Notably, I had recently been honored with an award from a prestigious society for my discovery and comprehensive understanding of the unique functions of a rare microorganism I had stumbled upon in the sand samples I analyzed during an overseas fossil excavation. It all started with my curiosity about why this microorganism was present in that particular stratum. As I unraveled the mystery through research, I learned about its critical role in evolution, prompting me to quickly write and submit a paper. This discovery kept me abroad longer than expected, and I got tied up in non-research related meetings and media interviews, consuming extra time. But I managed to return to the States just when I thought I could return to the Institute to continue my other research. I was ordered by the director to take a few days off as a reward to lay my plans. Since these opportunities are rare and there's not much else to do, I decided to visit my grandmother, so I headed straight to her place from the airport. You've been busy again, haven't you? Not really. It's more that the non-work stuff is bothersome. I saw you on TV. That party. You were wearing such a lovely dress. I was just dressed up and made up against my will. You looked like a completely different person than the usual, Sarah. I was just tired. Grandma's pumpkin stew is still the best. That's great to hear. If you want more, feel free to help yourself, my grandma warmly offered. As I arrived at her house, I settled into the cozy living room, savoring her delicious pumpkin stew and a cup of tea. My grandmother still lived alone in that house, and although she was advancing in age, her vitality remained, evident in her dedicated work in the garden. I silently hoped that she would continue to enjoy good health and stay energetic for many more years to come. Just as I was lost in these thoughts, the doorbell rang. Huh? The mail. That's unusual. My grandmother stood up and headed towards the entrance. Since I was little, this area has always been sparsely populated. The neighbors who know each family's composition rarely use the intercom for visits due to their close-knit nature. Even now, the only people who diligently ring the doorbell are delivery personnel. Since my grandmother never uses online shopping, I was wondering what could have been delivered. I could hear the sound of her slippers scraping the floor and the front door opening. I thought Grandma would return immediately after receiving the package. But she didn't come back right away. Instead, there seemed to be some commotion at the entrance. Sensing the uneasy atmosphere, I decided to go to the entrance myself. Ah, Sarah. As I left the living room and peeked down the hallway to the entrance, I heard someone calling my name behind my turning grandmother. At the door stood a man and a woman, and it was the woman who called my name. Sarah, I'm so glad. I wanted to see you. She beckoned for me to approach. Initially, I couldn't recognize them. After all, it had been 20 long years since I had last seen them. The two people before me, desperately calling my name with strained, forced smiles, were my significantly aged father and mother. Why are they here? What do they want? After 20 years of no contact? After they abandoned me 20 years ago? Laura, you and David have no face to show Sarah. My grandmother raised her voice at my mother. Just stay out of it, Mom. Sarah is my daughter. You never acted like a parent. How dare you? Sarah, come here, let's celebrate. You've done well, my parents exclaimed in unison, still yelling, observing my parents' commotion. I realized they knew about my recent award. They probably didn't expect me to be here, but the only connection they had to me was through my grandmother. So they came here. And by a stroke of bad luck, for mere good luck for them, they found me visiting. Keep it down. You're disturbing the neighbors, I stated firmly. And my parents stiffened and closed their mouths. They seemed to be somewhat aware of their absurd behavior. I won't let you inside the house. Just explain briefly why you are here. If you make any more noise or trouble, I'll call the police right away. Now speak when I urge them to talk. My parents exchanged glances, and then they started sharing their story. They explained that things took a turn for my brother after he entered college. He managed to secure a spot at one of the top universities, just as our parents had hoped. However, once he arrived there, he was exposed to a whole new set of values that were different from those instilled by our parents. He was surrounded by brilliant students with strong wills and diverse aspirations, witnessing his peers passionately pursuing a variety of dreams. As a result, my brother began to question the academic elitism he had been raised with and grew to resent our parents' excessive obsession with educational credentials. My brother disappeared during his senior year of college, leaving a note saying, "Don't look for me." He's still missing to this day after being abandoned by my brother, who they had invested so much time, effort, and money in. My parents went on a spending spree in their turmoil. To me, it made no sense that maybe they were trying to fill the void of loneliness with other things. I wanted to say they should have been more concerned about my brother, but I realized once again, these people couldn't possibly have such feelings. Naturally, their savings dwindled, and it impacted their real lives. They started lashing out at others, at their workplaces. My mother, a teacher, was overly strict with her students and excessively interfered with their futures, eventually causing several students to stop attending school. She also harassed and verbally abused younger colleagues, leading to recordings of her actions being submitted to the education board, resulting in disciplinary action. Both parents are being threatened with lawsuits by lawyers from both sides. My father to behave similarly. Looking down on colleagues with lower educational backgrounds, he made unbearable remarks and acted high-handedly. Not only that, but he also treated hospital patients in the same manner and even made advances towards female patients he fancied. It appeared that my parents were on the verge of facing legal troubles due to their actions. I sensed that they had pushed their limits without anyone to rein them in. With tears in their eyes, they explained their predicament and then leaned toward me. "Sarah, we want to reunite as a family, supporting each other," they said. "You were truly our daughter all along, and you've done so well." Amazing. You must be famous in your field by now. With fame comes authority. From now on, support each other. What do you mean? That was an unforgivable remark. Support each other now, after all this time. But we're family. I interrupted my parents' words with a question, shocking them. Family. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? We might share genes, but we're not a family, are we? Why would you say that? My mother's voice grew louder, trying to stop me. I even felt a sense of nostalgia in that unchanged voice of hers. And then I realized I'm not afraid of them anymore. Not even a little bit. Also, stop twisting things to your convenience. You're only here because you're facing huge compensations. You can't pay, right? You're relying on me. But is it because my brother is gone and now it's my turn? Or is it because you've run out of money to the point where you have to rely on the daughter you abandoned? As I spoke calmly, my father was speechless that my mother glared at me with wide eyes. "Sarah, how can you say that? We're family, and family should support each other. You're just shocked because we haven't seen each other in so long, right?" they said, trying to reassure me. "Don't worry. From now on, we'll live together, and we can adapt to each other's pace." But I couldn't bear it any longer. With a firm tone, I immediately responded, "That's a joke. Absolutely not. I refuse. I don't want to talk to you ever again. Please leave." I couldn't fathom the idea of living with them after everything that had transpired. Even as my parents started yelling and screaming, my heart remained cold. "Sarah, how can you talk to your parents like that? Hurry up and pack your things. Take us to your house." My parents' words became increasingly rough, even though I said I didn't want to live together. They intended to barge into my home. It made me chuckle. In fact, it seemed that my expression reflected that sentiment. Somehow I felt a faint smile forming just as you treated me like I'm not your child. I've never thought of you as parents. To suddenly be told by strangers that we're a family and should live together is nothing but terrifying. Your child is just your son. I want nothing to do with you from now on. I don't even want to be invited to the funeral. I contemplated. So this is what it means for your blood to boil? My gut felt like it was heating up, and it seemed like my blood pressure was on the rise. However, despite the turmoil in my body, my mind remained surprisingly composed. It was as if a cool breeze was gently wafting through my thoughts. This was something I had contemplated for a long time. Cutting ties might be necessary to navigate potential inheritance issues in the future, but severing the parent-child relationship would be an impossible feat. However, if I cut ties in practice and simply didn't communicate, that should work. Finally, my parents turned red in the face and started yelling, "What are you doing acting on your own? Who do you think paid for everything? Doctors have an obligation to help their parents. Do you understand how incredibly ungrateful you sound?" Once again, my parents began to yell, and I could only sigh. I wondered how I could make them understand. "Do you seriously think that just by giving money, you can call yourselves parents?" My grandmother said in a calm voice. I thought she was absolutely right. To me, those people weren't parents. Being a parent is a fact, isn't it? That's right. It seemed my grandmother's words didn't reach them. They continued to make incomprehensible claims loudly. My grandmother sighed at their persistently loud and incomprehensible arguments and turned on her heel. My parents were still shouting at that moment as some they heard a police siren getting louder and louder. I wondered if there had been an accident, but the car stopped in front of my grandmother's house. Police officers got out of the car, and there was a crowd of people around the patrol car. Even in the peaceful rural setting, if a heated argument like this erupted, the neighbors would soon take notice. It appeared that someone had called the police, mistaking it for a more serious incident. Despite the countryside setting, my parents appeared thoroughly flustered when the police arrived. They wore forced, overly friendly smiles and stuttered in their responses. I calmly explained to the police that my parents had left me behind, taking only my older brother, and that this was the first time I had seen them in 20 years. They said they want to live together. The people around us started to murmur. My parents glared at me, but their response seemed to make the situation more believable. The police officers kept my parents away, and in the meantime, we closed the front door and locked all the doors. As expected, my parents didn't come to the house afterward. I heard from the neighbors that my seemingly nice parents had a conversation with the police for a while, and then they left as if nothing had happened. After that, several days passed, but there was no sign of my parents. It seems that even the neighbors are keeping an eye out, but it seems that the two of them haven't come near this area. Could it be that they just came to visit me as a last resort? I had to return home before the vacation ended, and I had relaxed a little when a visitor came to my grandmother's house again. "Hey, long time no see, Sarah," my big brother greeted me. He had a sun-kissed tan and his hair was long, casually tied up. I recognized him by the smile on his face as he called my name. Standing at the entrance was my brother, who had disappeared some time ago and hadn't been heard from in several years. I led my brother into the living room and sat down to hear the details while reconnecting with various people from his college life. My brother became aware of our parents' abnormality and had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to escape from that house. While working part-time, he had accumulated enough funds, and when the time was right, he left the country. His goal was to see various people and various parts of the world while traveling around the world. He worked locally and he said he took many photos. When he posted those photos on social media, a publishing company contacted him asking if he wanted to open a photography shop. He accepted the offer in exchange for them providing him with photography jobs. That's why he had returned to the States after several years. When I was in Rome, I happened to see you on the news, Sarah. Oh, from when I won the award. Yep, you got it. You talked about Grandma in that interview, remember? My return to the States was driven by a desire to see Grandma, but there was another reason, Sarah. I wanted to find you, my brother declared. His cheerful laughter suddenly gave way to a serious, straightened posture as he looked me in the eyes. Sarah, I'm truly sorry for everything that happened in the past, you know? Why are you saying this all of a sudden? It's not sudden. I've been wanting to apologize to you every time I saw you. My brother wasn't smiling at all. I didn't really think much about it back then when we were living together in that house. We didn't have meals together, and on holidays I was the only one our parents would take out. Even though there was an obvious difference in the clothes we wore, I didn't find it strange. I was just focused on my studies, and during that time I thought we were just normal siblings who played together, he said, furrowing his brows and clenching his hands on his knees, shaking his head. When I mentioned having a sister to the people in my college seminar, sharing stories from our past, their reactions were a mix of surprise and shock. It was at that moment that I fully grasped that you had every right to resent me, my brother admitted. I should have gone to apologize right after I left home. I shouldn't have put it off until now. I'm deeply sorry for leading a carefree life while you were enduring so much hardship. He lowered his gaze. I truly should have gone to apologize as soon as I left home. But I'm sorry I put it off until now. I'm sorry that I thought it was normal for you to live a normal life when you were going through such a hard time. His heartfelt apology. Mimi, consider resenting my brother for the first time. However, I couldn't summon any negative feelings towards him and didn't harbor thoughts like why only me or why just my brother. At that time, I was preoccupied with our parents to the point where those thoughts rarely crossed my mind. I'm not angry and I don't resent you. Back then, you were the only one who really talked to me. I said, and my brother's face contorted in a pained expression upon hearing these words as tears welled up in my brother's eyes. Our grandmother approached with mitt and hands holding a plate. Would you both like to have some candied sweet potatoes? It was my grandmother's homemade candied sweet potatoes, made from the ones she had harvested from her garden and prepared since yesterday. Knowing this, I couldn't help but smile at my grandmother's deliberate attempt to recreate the atmosphere of the past, as if we have returned to those days. Wow, this really takes me back. I've been craving these for ages, my brother exclaimed. Yeah, Grandma's candied sweet potatoes are just the best, aren't they? I adored them when I was a kid. I know, I replied. Please help yourself to as many as you'd like. Let's savor them together. We sat across from each other at the table, sharing the same dish after such a long time. It was a heartwarming moment of connection. Just that simple act brought tears to our eyes. Despite the slightly salty taste, it was a precious moment. Afterward, I learned that our parents had to bear a significant amount of compensation and had further scandals that made headlines, ultimately losing their jobs. Currently, they seem to be living a modest life, working alongside people they once looked down upon due to their lower educational backgrounds. They had to humble themselves before younger supervisors with only high school diplomas. It must have been a humiliating experience, but I believed it was a necessary lesson for them. My brother and I, who had been separated for 20 years, began to frequently communicate, share meals, and visit our grandmother's house together. I was truly happy to spend time with my brother as a family, grateful for the moments we shared with our grandmother. My brother and I felt content in both my personal and public life. This story is titled, Soon to be Ex-Wife Demand. I took care of her baby with her brother-in-law, saying her body, her choice, so I also made my choice, but it destroyed her life. Hey everyone, the channel's been slowing down a bit, and I spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world and helps keep this journey going strong. Let's grow together. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, all right, let me start from the beginning because I feel like this story has so many layers that even I have trouble wrapping my head around it sometimes. My soon-to-be ex-wife, we'll just call her Kay for now, and I are technically still married, but only because of the legal system. Where we live, you have to be separated for 12 months before you can actually get divorced, which honestly just feels like dragging out the inevitable at this point. During this cooling off period, she was supposed to find her own place nearby to make 50-50 custody of our 3 kids easier. Now, why are we getting divorced? Well, Kay's twin sister, let's call her Jay, came up with this brilliant idea that Kay should be their surrogate. Jay and her husband, we'll call him B, have apparently been struggling to have kids. Totally sucks for them, I get it. But instead of, I don't know, using a regular surrogate or adoption or literally any other option, they decided that because Jay and Kay are twins, Kay was the perfect choice to carry their baby. Now, I didn't find out about this plan until way later. Turns out, this had been in the works for weeks before I even got a whiff of it. It wasn't like they sat down with me to have a proper conversation. No, that would have been too logical. Instead, Kay kind of casually mentioned it to me one night like it was no big deal. At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, who just decides to carry someone else's baby without talking to their partner first? But nope, she was dead serious. She had this whole speech lined up about how it was her body, her choice, and that I had no right to say no. And honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. Her body, her choice, sure. But then she hit me with this ultimatum. Either I support her decision, or we divorce. She didn't say it in those exact words, but that was the vibe. Like, this is happening whether you like it or not. So either get on board, or get out. I was floored. It wasn't just the surrogacy itself that bothered me. Though, yeah, that was a huge part of it. It was the fact that this had all been planned behind my back. KJ and B had been scheming this whole thing for weeks, maybe even months, without even giving me a heads up. And now I'm just supposed to be cool with it? Yeah, no. I told her straight up, if she goes through with this, we're done. She acted like I was being unreasonable. She said I was overreacting, and that this was a beautiful thing she was doing for her sister. But I don't know, man. Call me old-fashioned, but I feel like if you're married, you shouldn't be making life-altering decisions without at least consulting your spouse, especially when that decision involves, creating a whole-ass human being. Fast forward a few months, and guess what? She's pregnant. When she told me, I just nodded and said, okay, then walked out of the room. 2 days later, I filed for divorce. Apparently, this shocked everyone. Kay acted like she didn't see it coming, which honestly blows my mind. Like, I literally told you this exact thing would happen. What did you think? That I was bluffing? That I'd just magically get over it and be okay with raising someone else's kid? J and B weren't any better. They tried to guilt trip me into staying, saying I was abandoning my wife and that I should be supporting her during this beautiful journey. But here's the thing. They're the ones who wanted this baby, not me. So why is it my job to pick up the pieces now? I told them straight up, she's your responsibility now. It was like talking to a brick wall. They kept saying stuff like, but you're her husband. You vowed to stand by her no matter what. And I was like, yeah, well, she also vowed to respect me and not make massive life decisions without my input. So here we are. Anyway, that's how the separation started. At first, Kay acted like she didn't care. She was all high and mighty, saying she didn't need me and that she could handle this on her own. But as the months went on, it became pretty clear that she was in over her head. After I filed for divorce, things got real awkward in the house. Kay started acting like nothing had changed, as if I was still supposed to care about her pregnancy, or worse, like I should be involved in it somehow. Meanwhile, I was already mentally checked out. I mean, why would I invest any energy into a pregnancy that A, wasn't mine, and B, was the exact reason we were splitting up? The house dynamic got tense fast. Kay didn't move out because, surprise, finding a place in our area isn't easy, especially when you're pregnant. She kept saying she wanted to stay close for the kids' sake, but let's be honest, it was more about convenience for her. Every time she asked me for something, it felt like she was still expecting husband mode from me. Like, no, I'm not running to the store for pickles and ice cream at 11 p.m. anymore. That's not my job now. She started dropping hints about how stressful everything was and how hard it is to do this alone. At first, I just ignored her. I mean, what did she expect? Wasn't going to swoop in and save the day like I had during her previous pregnancies? Those were our kids, and this? This was entirely her and her sister's decision. I didn't sign up for any of it. Eventually, the hints turned into outright complaints. She'd say things like, I don't know how I'm going to do this without you, and it's not fair that I have to go through this alone. I told her, plain and simple, to call J and B. They're the ones who wanted this baby. They're the ones who made all these promises about how amazing this surrogacy journey would be. Let them step up. But of course, they were nowhere to be found most of the time. B in particular seemed to be checking out of the whole situation. He'd show up for the big stuff, like doctor's appointments, but day to day, he was MIA. When I asked Kay about it, mainly out of curiosity, not concern, she said he was busy taking care of J, who was still recovering from her car accident. Fair enough, I guess, but it's not like he didn't know this baby was coming. Shouldn't he have planned for this? Kay didn't seem to want to admit that B's priorities had shifted. She kept making excuses for him, saying things like, he's doing his best, or he's under a lot of stress right now. Meanwhile, she was leaning harder and harder on me, as if I was somehow obligated to pick up the slack. She'd ask me to help with little things, carrying groceries, setting up the crib, even rubbing her back when she was sore. Every time I told her no. Not my kid, not my problem. One night, things came to a head. She was sitting on the couch, rubbing her belly and sighing dramatically, clearly trying to get my attention. Finally, she said, you're still my husband. You could at least pretend to care. I snapped. I told her, no, I'm not your husband anymore. Not in any way that matters. You made your choice when you decided to do this behind my back. Don't come to me now because you're realizing it's harder than you thought. Call B, call J. Call literally anyone else, but leave me out of it. She cried, of course. That's become her go-to reaction whenever things don't go her way. But at this point, I was immune to it. I told her I was going to bed and left her there sobbing on the couch. The next few weeks were more of the same. She'd try to guilt me into helping, and I'd shut her down every time. It wasn't just about setting boundaries for myself, though that was a big part of it. It was also about principle. If I started helping now, even a little, she'd take it as a sign that I was softening, and then I'd never be able to get out from under her demands. Things took another turn when the baby was born. I stayed out of it completely. Didn't go to the hospital, didn't visit, nothing. I told her ahead of time that I wouldn't be involved, so it wasn't like she didn't know. Still, she called me from the hospital, crying and begging me to come. She said she was scared, that she didn't want to be alone, that I was being cruel. I stayed firm. I told her to call B. She hung up on me. When she came home with the baby, that's when the real chaos started. It was like she thought bringing the baby into the house would magically make me care. Spoiler, it didn't. She'd leave the baby's stuff all over the place. Bottles in the kitchen, diapers on the couch, as if to force me into acknowledging it, but I didn't bite. I just stepped over the mess and went about my day. At night, it was even worse. The baby would cry and she'd come to my room, knocking on the door and asking if I could help just this once. I'd tell her no every single time. She'd get mad, stomp off, and then spend the next day slamming cabinets or muttering under her breath about what a terrible person I am. I'll admit, there were moments when I felt a twinge of guilt, not because I thought I was wrong, but because the baby was innocent in all this. It's not the kid's fault that their parents are a mess, but at the same time, I knew that stepping in wouldn't actually help the situation. It would just enable Kay to keep relying on me instead of the people who actually wanted this baby in the first place. The final straw came when Kay outright demanded that I take a more active role. She said it wasn't fair that she was doing everything on her own, that I was being selfish, that I owed her this much. I told her, flat out, I don't owe you anything. This is your responsibility. Deal with it. That's when she really lost it. She called me every name in the book, said I was a heartless monster, that I'd regret this one day. Then she packed up a bag, grabbed the baby, and left. I didn't try to stop her. Update 1 point. Hey Reddit, so lots of you are asking for an update, so here it is. 2 days after Kay left with the baby, I thought, finally, this might actually be the break I need. I wasn't naive enough to believe she was gone for good, but for a couple of days, the house was quiet. No crying baby, no guilt trips, no arguments. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But of course, nothing ever stays simple when Kay is involved. The calls started the next morning. First from her mom, then her sister. Yes, the same sister who masterminded this whole mess. And even her sister's husband. It was like they'd coordinated a campaign to wear me down. Every single one of them had the same talking points. Kay was overwhelmed, the baby was innocent, and I needed to step up for the sake of the family. Jay, her twin sister, was especially relentless. She left this long voicemail where she basically called me heartless for abandoning my wife during such a vulnerable time. Like, are you kidding me? This wasn't some surprise pregnancy that we'd both signed up for. This was her choice, a choice she made without consulting me, and a choice I explicitly told her I wouldn't support. I didn't respond to Jay's message. Honestly, what was the point? Then there was B, the baby's biological father. He tried to play the sympathy card, saying how hard things were with Jay still recovering from her accident. He even had the audacity to say, "We're all family, man. We should be supporting each other." Family? Are you joking? The guy barely lifted a finger during the pregnancy, and now he's acting like we're some kind of team? I told him exactly what I'd been telling everyone else. This isn't my problem. Step up and take care of your own kid. What really floored me, though, was Kay's mom. She's usually pretty reasonable, but even she was on Kay's side this time. She called me up saying how disappointed she was in me, that she raised me better than this, and that Kay was still my wife. I cut her off right there. No, she's not, I told her. She stopped being my wife the moment she decided to have another man's baby. If you care so much, maybe you should be the one helping her. Silence. She hung up after that. I think it finally hit her that I wasn't going to cave. A couple of days later, Kay came back. I knew she would eventually, but I wasn't prepared for the scene she brought with her. She walked in like she hadn't just called me every name under the sun before storming out. She had the baby strapped to her chest in one of those carriers, looking exhausted but defiant. I could tell right away she was gearing up for another round. She didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the living room like she was about to give some kind of TED talk. I didn't even look up from what I was doing. "About what?" "About this," she said, gesturing to the baby like I didn't know what this was. "You can't just ignore us forever." "I'm not ignoring you," I said. "I've been very clear. This is your responsibility, not mine." She launched into this long-winded speech about how hard it was being a single mom and how unfair it was that she had to do everything on her own. She kept saying things like, "This isn't what I signed up for," and "I never thought you'd turn your back on me like this." I sat there, letting her talk. Because honestly, what was the point of arguing? She wasn't looking for a solution. She just wanted someone to blame. When she finally stopped, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You signed up for this the moment you decided to carry their baby. Don't act like this is my fault." That set her off. She started yelling about how I was being cruel, how I didn't understand what she was going through, and how I'd regret this someday. The baby started crying, probably because Kay was yelling so loud, and she snapped at me to do something. I just shrugged and said, "Not my kid." She stormed off to the bedroom after that, slamming the door so hard it shook the walls. The baby kept crying, but I didn't move. If she wanted to scream and slam doors, fine. But I wasn't about to let her dump her problems on me. That night, she tried a different tactic. Instead of yelling, she came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and tried to play nice. She started talking about how she missed the way things used to be, how she still loved me, and how she wanted us to be a family again. She even apologized, sort of. She said she was sorry for how things turned out, but she still didn't take any responsibility for her choices. I wasn't buying it. I told her that ship had sailed. "You made your decision," I said. "Now you have to live with it." She started crying again, saying she didn't want to get divorced and that she couldn't do this on her own. I told her she didn't have to do it alone. She had J and B, but that wasn't what she wanted to hear. She wanted me to swoop in and save the day, just like I'd always done before. But not this time. When I went to bed that night, I could hear her crying in the next room. I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't feel bad either. I felt nothing. And that's when I knew for sure it was over. Whatever love or connection we'd had was gone. She'd burned it all to the ground with her choices. The next morning, she tried one last Hail Mary. She came to me with the baby, looking desperate and sleep-deprived. "Please," she said, "just hold her for a little while so I can sleep. I haven't had more than 2 hours in days." I looked at her, and for a second, I almost caved. Almost. But then I thought about everything that had led up to this moment. How she'd lied, how she'd betrayed my trust, how she'd dragged me into a mess I never agreed to. And I said no. "Call B," I told her. "He's the father. He should be helping you." She looked like I'd slapped her. "You really hate me that much, don't you?" she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I'm not going to let you guilt me into cleaning up your mess. This isn't my responsibility, and I'm done pretending it is." She left again after that, and this time, I think it might be for good. Her mom called me later, saying Kay was staying with her for now. I told her that was probably for the best. Maybe now I can finally get some peace. Update 2.0. Okay, it is my. Again, here is what's been going on. 3 days. After Kay left the second time, things settled down for a while, but not in the way you might think. The house was quiet, sure, but it wasn't peaceful. I had this constant nagging feeling that something else was coming, like the calm before a storm, and I wasn't wrong. About a week after she moved out, I started getting letters and emails from Kay's family. Not just the usual guilt trips and emotional manipulation, but full-on arguments, as if they were trying to wear me down with sheer volume. Her mom wrote me this long letter about how I was being unreasonable and how family always comes first. She talked about how hard things had been for Kay growing up, how much she sacrificed, and how I owed it to her to support her now. I read it, sighed, and tossed it in the trash. What was I supposed to do with that? Wasn't like they were saying anything new. They'd been on this "you're the bad guy" train since the beginning, and at this point, it was just noise. J and B, on the other hand, tried a more direct approach. B showed up at my house unannounced one evening. I opened the door, saw him standing there looking all awkward, and immediately knew this wasn't going to go well. "Hey, man," he said, trying to sound casual. "Can we talk?" I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. "About what?" He shifted uncomfortably, like he was debating whether to come in or just run for it. Finally, he said, "About the baby. About everything, really." I didn't move. "Say what you need to say." He looked surprised, like he thought I'd invite him in or something. Not a chance. He started rambling about how hard things had been for him since Jay's accident, how he was trying to juggle everything, and how he really needed me to step up and help out for Kay's sake. "For Kay's sake?" I repeated, cutting him off. "This has nothing to do with me. That's your baby. Your wife's sister agreed to this knowing full well what it meant. Why are you even here?" He looked flustered. "It's not just about the baby. It's about family. We're all connected in this." I couldn't help but laugh. "No, we're not. You, Jay, and Kay decided all this behind my back. You excluded me, and now you're acting like I owe you something? Get real." He tried to argue some more, but I wasn't having it. I told him to leave and not come back unless it was to take full responsibility for his kid. He didn't like that answer, but he didn't have much of a choice. He left, muttering something about how I'd regret this. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Either way, it's not my problem. Meanwhile, Kay was still at her mom's, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally started to figure things out. But nope. Instead, she started using the kids as leverage. She called one night and asked if she could come over to spend time with them. I said sure because they're still her kids, and I'm not going to keep them from her. When she showed up, though, it was clear she had an agenda. She spent the whole evening talking about how hard things were for her, how the baby kept her up all night, and how she just needed a little help to get back on her feet. She even brought up the idea of moving back in, just until she could figure things out. I shut that down immediately. No, I told her. You made your choice. You don't get to come back here and act like nothing happened. She tried to argue, of course. She said it wasn't fair to the kids to keep their family apart, and that I was being selfish. I reminded her that she was the one who decided to blow up our marriage for her sister. You don't get to play the victim here, I said. You chose this. Now live with it. That was the first time I saw real anger in her eyes. Up until then, it had mostly been sadness, guilt-tripping, and frustration. But this was different. She looked at me like I was the worst person on the planet and said, "You'll regret this one day. I promise you." Then she grabbed her stuff and left, slamming the door behind her. The weeks that followed were surprisingly uneventful. I settled into a routine with the kids, focusing on giving them as much stability as I could. They asked about their mom sometimes, why she wasn't living with us, why things were different, but I kept my answers simple. Mom and I are figuring things out, I'd say, but we both love you very much. It wasn't a lie exactly. I still loved my kids more than anything, and I knew Kay did too, in her own way. But that didn't change the fact that we were on completely different paths now. She'd made her bed, and I wasn't about to climb into it with her. That said, I couldn't help but notice how much lighter I felt without her constant presence. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells or dealing with her drama. It was just me and the kids, figuring things out one day at a time. And honestly, it felt good. Then came the legal stuff. Divorce proceedings officially started, and that opened up a whole new can of worms. Kay's lawyer tried to paint me as the unreasonable one, saying I'd abandoned her during a difficult time and refused to help with the baby. My lawyer countered with the facts. The baby wasn't mine, I had no obligation to help, and Kay had made the decision to go through with the surrogacy despite my objections. It was messy, but I wasn't worried. The truth was on my side, and I had plenty of documentation to back it up. Texts, emails, even voicemails. All of it showed that Kay knew exactly what she was doing, and that I'd been clear about my boundaries from the start. Still, it was exhausting. Every time I thought I was done dealing with her drama, something new would pop up. Her family kept reaching out, trying to guilt me into making things right. Even J and B tried to mediate, as if they had any right to tell me how to handle my life. I ignored them all. I'd spent enough time cleaning up Kay's messes, and I wasn't about to start again now. Sacrifor. Through it all, one thing became crystal clear. I was done. Done with the guilt, done with the manipulation, done with the constant drama. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own life again. And no matter how much Kay and her family tried to pull me back in, I wasn't going to let them. This was my chance to start over, to rebuild, to focus on the things that really mattered. My kids, my own happiness, and a future where I wasn't constantly cleaning up someone else's mess. And for the first time in months, I felt like that future was within reach. Final update. Hey guys, this is my last update. Here is what has been going on. After weeks of back and forth drama, I finally got a taste of what my life might look like without Kay's constant chaos. It wasn't perfect. I was still navigating how to balance work, being there for my kids, and the mess that was the ongoing divorce. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like things were heading in the right direction. Kay stayed with her mom for the most part, which made things less tense around the house. She still had her visitation days with the kids, and while I wanted to keep the peace for their sake, it wasn't always smooth sailing. During one of her visits, the kids came back talking about the baby. My youngest asked if their new sibling was going to live with us eventually. That hit me like a punch to the gut. I had to sit them down and explain, carefully, that the baby wasn't their sibling in the way they were thinking. I told them that the baby was staying with their aunt and uncle, and that while their mom had helped bring the baby into the world, it didn't mean they'd be living with us or playing the same role as a brother or sister. My oldest nodded, clearly trying to act like they understood, but I could tell they had more questions. My youngest just asked, "But why isn't the baby like us? How do you explain surrogacy to kids? How do you make them understand that their mom's choices had nothing to do with them, while also being honest without bad-mouthing her?" I did my best, but that conversation stuck with me for days. Meanwhile, I had my own life to sort out. The divorce wasn't just emotionally draining. It was financially draining, too. Kay's lawyer was pushing for spousal support, arguing that she couldn't work because of the baby. My lawyer and I countered that the baby wasn't mine, that this was a surrogacy agreement she had willingly entered into, and that she had her sister and brother-in-law for support. It was an uphill battle, though, because the court kept wanting to consider the best interests of the children. Of course, I wanted what was best for my kids, but I wasn't about to let Kay use them as leverage to squeeze more money out of me. To make matters worse, her family started meddling again. Jay sent me this long, dramatic email about how I was punishing Kay for doing something selfless, and how it wasn't fair for her to be struggling while I was living comfortably. First of all, I wasn't exactly living in luxury. I was juggling work and raising 3 kids on my own. Second, Kay's struggles weren't my responsibility anymore. She made her bed, now she had to lie in it. Still, the email got under my skin. It wasn't that I cared what Jay thought of me, but it was frustrating that they kept spinning this narrative where Kay was some kind of martyr and I was the villain. I wanted to reply, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. They'd already made up their minds about me, and no amount of explaining was going to change that. One surprising thing that came out of all this was how much closer I got to my own family. My mom, who had been my biggest supporter from the start, stepped up in ways I didn't expect. She started coming over more often to help with the kids, whether it was cooking dinner, helping with homework, or just giving me a break when I needed it. She also wasn't shy about telling me when I was being too stubborn or when I needed to lighten up. I didn't always agree with her, but I appreciated having someone in my corner who wasn't afraid to call me out when necessary. Even my dad, who usually keeps his opinions to himself, had a few choice words about the situation. He told me, "You did the right thing by sticking to your guns. People like Kay will always try to guilt you into cleaning up their messes, but you don't owe her anything. Just focus on your kids. That's what matters." That became my mantra. Focus on the kids. Every decision I made, every interaction with Kay, every argument with her family, I filtered it all through that lens. What's best for the kids? How can I give them as much stability as possible in the middle of all this chaos? Kay, on the other hand, seemed determined to make things harder than they needed to be. She'd text me at random times, asking for favors, or trying to rope me into her problems. One day, she called me in tears, saying she couldn't afford daycare for the baby and needed me to loan her money. I reminded her, again, that the baby wasn't my responsibility. She hung up on me, and 5 minutes later, I got a text from her mom calling me heartless. This became a pattern. Kay would hit a roadblock, and instead of dealing with it herself or turning to J and B, she'd try to drag me into it. At first, I'd respond politely but firmly. Over time, I stopped responding altogether. It wasn't my job to bail her out, and I wasn't going to let her guilt me into thinking otherwise. Despite everything, there were moments when I almost felt sorry for Kay. She looked worn down every time I saw her, like the weight of her decisions was finally catching up to her. During one of our custody exchanges, she asked if we could talk privately for a minute. I hesitated, but I agreed. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, not meeting my eyes. "For everything. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I didn't know how to respond to that." Part of me wanted to say, "It's too late for apologies." Another part wanted to ask her why she didn't think about the consequences before going through with all this. But instead, I just nodded and said, "I hope things work out for you." She looked like she wanted to say more, but I ended the conversation there. I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. Whatever guilt or regret she was feeling, that was her burden to carry, not mine. These days, I'm focused on rebuilding. The divorce is still in progress, but I'm doing everything I can to move forward. I've started setting boundaries with Kay's family. They don't call or email nearly as much anymore, and when they do, I ignore it unless it's directly about the kids. My lawyer is confident we'll get a fair custody arrangement, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the outcome. As for the kids, they're adjusting better than I expected. They still have questions, and I know it'll take time for them to fully understand everything, but they're resilient. They're the reason I get up every day and keep pushing through all the noise and nonsense. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you can't control what other people do. You can only control how you respond. And as much as Kay and her family tried to drag me into their mess, I've finally realized that it's okay to say no. It's okay to put myself and my kids first. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm starting to find my footing again. And honestly, it feels pretty damn good.
I should have known something was terribly wrong the moment I heard Clara's muffled voice through the door that day. It started like any other Saturday morning. I was pottering around the kitchen, enjoying a rare moment of quiet solitude before the rest of the house stirred to life. The clinking of ceramic on the countertop as I prepared my usual morning tea was the only sound, until Clara's urgent whispers broke the stillness. At first, I thought maybe she was on the phone with a friend, keeping her voice hushed so as not to wake Ethan. But as I paused to listen, the harsh, conspiratorial tone set me on edge. There was no warmth, no laughter in her clipped words, just a forceful intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Handled soon, before he gets suspicious," she hissed, her consonants sharp like icy needles. "Just make sure you're ready to move when I give the signal." My heart stammered in my chest as the implication of her words sank in like a stone to the pit of my stomach. She was plotting something deceitful, something aimed at hurting my Ethan. Of that, I had no doubt. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law, Clara, collapsed around me. Gone were the innocent smiles, the loving embraces she showered my only son with whenever I came to visit. Just one short, overheard conversation, and the woman I trusted with my family's happiness was suddenly a viper, poised to strike at our very hearts. How long had this malicious deceit been going on under my nose? What fresh hell was she concocting against my beloved boy, her own husband? 1,000 frantic thoughts whirled like a cyclone as fury and disbelief warred within me. I wanted to burst through that door right there and demand the truth. To grab Clara by her slender shoulders and shake it out of her until she spilled every last treacherous secret. But something held me back, a fleeting wisdom warning me not to expose my hand until I knew what game she was playing. For all my motherly instincts screamed at me to protect my child, I realized the smart play was to bide my time and lay in wait, to gather what evidence I could of her betrayal before raising the alarm, at least until I better understood the viper's nest I had unwittingly welcomed into my family. So I forced myself to retreat from that closed door, clutching the certainty of Clara's deception like a parcel of powdered glass. However sharp and wounding the truth, I knew it was the only way I could finally excise her lies from our lives for good. No matter what deep treachery she was spinning, I would not allow that deceitful snake to sink her fangs into my loved ones and inject her venom. If it was war Clara wanted, a war for the very soul of this family, then she just enlisted herself a determined enemy who would show no mercy in defending her kin. Our happy American dream of generations was suddenly hardening into a battlefield of looming familial crisis. But in that moment, I took a pained breath and soldiered on. For Ethan's sake, and for the sake of unraveling the dark truth before it ruined us all. I knew I needed concrete evidence of Clara's betrayal before confronting her. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch, paying attention to every hushed phone call and suspicious glance. The innocent facade she put on around Ethan only stoked my simmering fury. Finally, the break I was waiting for came when Clara left her laptop unattended in the living room one afternoon. A huge risk, considering what incriminating trails may be lurking in her digital footprints. I wasted no time seizing the opportunity to uncover the truth. With shaking hands, I lifted the laptop's lid, dreading what I might find, and that's when I saw it. The email correspondence laid bare like a ransacked tomb, her lurid sexts and explicit photos shared with not just one, but several men I didn't recognize. I felt physically ill, my stomach roiling as the full extent of her infidelity condensed into an inescapable reality. But even worse were the paper trails indicating her intentions to siphon money from Ethan's inheritance after taking out a secret life insurance policy. My hands went clammy, the laptop almost slipping from my grip. I couldn't process the malice, the sheer calculating greed she'd been operating with literally under our roof. This was so far beyond a simple tawdry affair. She was aiming to hollow out my son's life like a carved pumpkin and devour the leftover scraps. I don't know how long I sat there, tears of rage streaking down my cheeks as more and more damning evidence piled up on the screen. But eventually, the sound of the front door opening snapped me back to reality. I quickly closed the laptop, straightening myself up just as Clara emerged from the hallway. "Oh, good afternoon, Marlene," she chirped with that saccharine smile that turned my stomach. "Is everything okay?" I stared back at her, struggling to mask the disgust seething behind my eyes. She looked so unbearably smug, not an inkling of guilt over the depraved acts she'd been carrying out. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to grab her by her pretty, lying mouth and, no, I couldn't give in to that impulse, as satisfying as it may be. Not without irrefutable proof to back me up when the inevitable denials came. Steadying my nerves, I forced the most level tone I could manage. "Clara, we need to talk about what I found on your computer just now." Her eyes went wide, those loathsome lips parting in a small O as the implication sank in. But just as quickly, her expression contorted into a sneer. "How dare you go through my private things, you nosy old bat," she spat, all hints of sweetness evaporating like mist. "What, did Ethan put you up to this, trying to pin something on me so you can cry victim?" I recoiled at her venom, appalled at how quickly she went on the attack. But that contemptible, transparent attempt at reversal only strengthened my resolve. I would not be cowed by this vicious succubus a moment longer. "Don't insult my intelligence with your lies, you faithless snake," I shot back, feeling the words ripping up from my gut. "I saw everything on there, the texts, the videos, the policy info. You're nothing but a calculating, money-grubbing whore trying to bleed my family dry." Her mask shattered then, giving way to an expression of pure, glowering hatred. This was the real Clara, the soulless harpy hiding beneath cheap cosmetics and vapid smiles. As she opened her mouth to surely spew more venom in her sad defense, I held up a hand to silence her. "Save your pathetic denials. We're done here, you and I. One way or another, I'm going to make sure Ethan sees your worthless soul for what it truly is. Your grip on this family is slipping, you treacherous snake, and I'll spend every last breath ensuring you slither back to the gutter you came from." With that vow lingering in the air like a prophecy, I turned on my heel and stormed out, leaving her to stew in the putrid mess of her own making. She'd been unmasked, her decade-long charade shattered beyond repair. From here on out, it was scorched earth. Or so, help me, Clara would rue the day she dared make an enemy of this mother's wrath. After my explosive showdown with Clara, I knew I needed to make my next moves very carefully. As much as I wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops and watch her world burn, a small voice of reason warned me to be strategic. I had the proof of her deceit, but would it be enough to convince Ethan? Sitting alone in my bedroom that night, the weight of it all felt crushing. How could I get through to my son, make him see the vile beast wearing his wife's skin? I didn't have the luxury of subjecting him to the graphic evidence. That venom could scar him forever. There had to be another way to peel back the scales from his eyes. That's when the phone rang, the caller ID displaying a name I wasn't expecting. "Derek, everything okay over there?" My brother-in-law's gruff voice crackled over the line. "You've been awfully quiet the last few days." In that moment, it was like the universe was presenting me with an ally, someone to help shoulder this burden. Fighting back tears, I quickly unloaded everything to Derek. The overheard conversation, the emails, the videos, all of Clara's sordid transgressions laid out. There was a long pause before he finally responded, rage simmering in his tone, that godless little harlot. We spent the next few hours strategizing, knowing we needed an airtight case to make Ethan a true believer. As much as it killed me, Derek warned that simply dumping the evidence on him could push Clara to retaliate, try to manipulate the narrative her way. We need to bait her into slipping up, get her nefarious plans on record, so that Snake has nowhere left to wiggle, he said, his words like arcs of electricity reigniting my dwindling resolve. With his help, I began meticulously documenting Clara's daily activities, taking screenshots of her shadier behavior and cataloging every incident that reeked of deception. We'd get that hellspawn to show her true ugly colors eventually, and by God, Ethan would bear witness. And we had an ally in a very unlikely place. Derek's own daughter, Lena, my sweet, mild-mannered niece. When I finally confided the truth to her, the blaze that erupted in her eyes was stunning, almost feral. "That backstabbing bitch has violated the sanctity of this family," she hissed, more venom than I'd ever heard from her gentle lips. "Count me in to help take her down. I won't let that whore get away with this." With Lena joining the cause, the chink in Clara's facade finally began to show ever so slightly. My niece took great delight in concocting subtle ways to shake that wretched harpy's confidence, keeping her always just a bit off-kilter and paranoid, knowing we lurked around the corner. Every sidelong glance, every bitten lip and shift of the eyes when we'd suddenly appear, felt like a delicious victory. Clara was the trapped rat for a change, her beady eyes darting around as the jaws of ruination began closing in. Just a bit longer, and she'd slip up spectacularly. Gone were any hesitations about ruthlessly exposing this schemer's depravity. With Derek and Lena by my side, I knew I had the family's full might aligned against Clara's sadistic machinations. For months, that godless vulture had been feeding on our love, our trust, but now the predator was about to become the prey. Whichever hole Clara thought she could slither out of this through, we would seal it shut, without mercy. Her despicable reign of betrayal was nearing its inevitable, fiery end. And as the splinter of loved ones committed to her demise, we would ensure the inferno that consumed her left no secrets remaining. With Derek and Lena fully committed to our cause, we knew the key was to bait Clara into revealing the full extent of her nefarious intentions. Simply confronting her again would only cause her to lash out with more denials and manipulations. No, this venomous serpent needed to be flushed completely into the open. Our best shot was to dangle something irresistible in front of her greedy snout, an opportunity she couldn't refuse to take advantage of and swindle from Ethan. Derek had the perfect scheme, one that made my stomach churn with guilt, but was ultimately necessary for the sting operation. We set up an investment plan, make it look incredibly lucrative. He explained in hushed tones over coffee one morning. Give Clara all the breadcrumbs to sniff out passwords, financial details, everything she needs. You want us to tempt her? I shook my head slowly. Deceiving her is one thing, but concocting an entire fabrication feels like we're stooping to her level of moral bankruptcy? Lena interjected, eyes blazing with determination. That's exactly the point, Aunt Marlene. We can't play by the rules with someone as unscrupulous as that two-faced gutter rat. We lay the perfect trap to make her true nature inescapable. As much as it turned my stomach, I knew they were right. Clara had declared war on our family a long time ago. Our mutually assured destruction was the only path to excising her malignancy for good. Okay, I relented with a weary sigh. If this is what it takes to rid us of that toxic succubus, let's do it. What's the play? Over the next few weeks, we carefully constructed an airtight honeypot tailored to appeal precisely to Clara's insatiable greed and blatant disregard for ethics. A too-good-to-be-true investment vehicle, with documents and financials readied, just waiting for her thieving tendrils to start slithering all over it. Derek and I played the parts of bumbling family members, feigning confusion over these perplexing investments as Clara's eyes gleamed with avarice. It made me want to vomit, watching her perfectly conceal the ravenous glee behind that vapid beauty queen smirk as the trap was set. You know, these financials seem complicated, Derek said one afternoon as we discussed the details over lunch. I really could use someone smarter with this kind of thing to take a look. Like piranha scenting blood in the water, Clara's whole demeanor shifted, her carefully practiced look of concern barely masking the predatory hunger in her dark eyes. Oh, Derek, you know I'm always happy to help out however I can with this sort of thing. She chirped in that saccharine lilt that made my molars grind. Why don't you pass those documents along and I'll take a look this evening? No pressure at all, but I'd hate to see an opportunity slip through the cracks. The dewy-eyed look of faux innocence she shot my way caused a flare of anger to surge through me. That forked tongue might as well be lashing out between her deceitful lips. But I bit back the venom welling up, forcing myself to play along. Are you sure, dear? I feel just awful piling more on your plate. Absolutely. Think nothing of it. The raptor gave a disarming chuckle, waving away my faux concern with perfectly manicured talons. It'll be my pleasure to lend my expertise. I'll go over each and every detail to make sure we don't miss a single lucrative window. I caught the briefest of looks between Lena and Derek, then a momentary flicker of disgust at the shameless deceit saturating Clara's every word. But we all remained steadfast, treading carefully as the viper began uncoiling itself around our tempting lure. Thank you so much, dear. I can always count on you to look out for this family's best interests, I said, forcing the most warm, grandmotherly tone I could muster as the muscles in my jaw clenched. Whether Clara believed the sincerity in my voice or not, she simply offered one of her plastic smiles in return, already lost in the first visions of her duplicitous plundering. Like capturing a venomous serpent, we held our breath, waiting for her to fully slither into the trap's confines. The first phase was complete. Now all that remained was springing it shut, sinking our fangs into the very heart of this deception before ripping Clara's facade to shreds once and for all. With Clara thoroughly ensnared by the bait we'd laid out, all that remained was to reel her in for the ultimate undoing. Anticipation coursed through me with every concealed glance I caught of her poring over the fabricated investment details. The arrogant smirk curling her lips told me everything. This was the moment she'd burn her last credible mask to ashes. The plan was for Lena to take the lead, playing the role of naive accomplice to draw Clara's full corruptive forces into the open. As the youngest of us, she could most easily appeal to that Black Widow's sense of overconfidence and make her slip up fatally. "I just don't quite understand these prospectus forms," Lena said with perfectly feigned confusion one evening as Clara leaned over the documents. "It all seems so complicated, definitely more than I'm equipped to handle." That was Derek's cue to make an overly theatrical show of heading out. "Well, if you bright ladies have it covered, I'll leave you to it. Marlene and I actually have an appointment to get going to." "Yes, we really must get moving," I added with a pointed look towards my traitorous daughter-in-law. "You don't mind keeping an eye on things here for a while, do you, Clara dear?" The she-devil looked up from the papers with a smile so calculated it could have been printer-generated. "Of course. I'd be simply delighted to walk Lena through all the finer points." And with that, Derek and I made our exit, leaving the trap ready to be sprung. I had to hand it to my niece. Lena played the role of helpless ingenue flawlessly, as Clara huffed and puffed through lengthy explanations, deliciously unaware of the noose tightening around her with every word. Sequestered away and monitoring the audio-video feed, I fought to keep my fury in check as Clara's contemptuous mask slipped fully away. The condescending laughter, the flagrant insults about our collective intelligence. It was like she simply couldn't resist the urge to revel in her own smug superiority. "I swear, you poor dear, it's a miracle you're not institutionalized with how little you understand," she gloated with an exaggerated roll of her eyes. "Thank goodness you'll have me around to handle matters like these. Lord knows your idiot family would bungle it into bankruptcy before the first quarter's figures even hit." Lena recoiled with a perfectly delivered flinch, suckering Clara into brazenly continuing her torrent of bile. "Seriously, why do you think I've stuck around playing dutiful wife to that dullard Ethan all these years? Certainly not for his rapturous skills in the bedroom, I can tell you that." Her derisive cackle pierced the airwaves, the sound of rancid nails on chalkboard scraping against my very soul. Mercifully, Lena allowed only the faintest look of shock to cross her features in response. "Well, you always did seem to dote on him so supportively," she managed to stammer through expertly feigned distress. "Does that mean you've been faking it all along?" In an instant, Clara's expression went predatory, like a shark scenting chum in the water as she leaned in conspiratorially close. "Fake it?" she hissed with sneering contempt. "Oh, honey, I've been meticulously planning this family's demise since before I even met that sad sack of a husband." With those damning words vocalized, the final hook was baited. I watched in speechless revulsion as Clara enthusiastically divulged every last lurid detail of her machinations, the ulterior motives behind their marriage, the mistress arrangements with her lovers, the insurance fraud schemes, and slow marination of Ethan's finances into her control. She held nothing back, so thoroughly convinced of her complete triumph over our pitiful family. "I've been drip-feeding that simple-minded oaf his own cuckoldry for years now," she cackled with revolting glee. "And once I finally gain dominion over his family's assets, I'll detonate the whole truth bomb right in his stupid face, just to watch it shatter him. He'll be left with nothing, no wife, no money, no pride. Just a broken, blubbering mess for me to grind my heels on one final time before exiting stage left as the big winner. As her malicious victory lap reached its crescendo of depravity, I heard a sudden clatter from the other room as Lena lost her composure, shoulders heaving with rage and heartbreak, even through her acting talents. The counterfeit empress clasped her hands in triumph, savoring every last shred of her perceived conquest with sadistic glee. Her very presence was a cancer metastasizing throughout my entire family. But now, we finally had every last diseased cell captured and ready for the eternal quarantine it so richly deserved. With Clara's damning confession secured, the final phase of our intricate sting was deployed. We arranged for a family gathering under the premise of Ethan's birthday celebration, one final ode to normalcy before ripping the veil away. As the hours ticked closer, my nerves reached a fever pitch, knowing this intersection could shatter relationships beyond repair. But Clara's overwhelming malice overshadowed any fear. She needed to be exposed, no matter how much anguish it caused. Evil this deeply rooted could not be allowed to fester any longer within our family. Seeing Ethan's bright smile as he embraced his venomous wife made me physically ill. How could he remain so blindingly oblivious to the viper coiled in his midst? It took everything I had to play the role of doting mother, feigning joy as gifts were exchanged and celebrations commenced. When the moment finally came, I exchanged a subtle nod with Derek and Lena. They moved to seal the exits as I stood, clearing my throat to gather the room's attention. Even Clara tilted her head inquisitively, that plastic smile straining at the corners as if she could somehow sense the trap about to spring shut. Before we continue with the festivities, there's an important matter we need to discuss, I began, unable to mask the tremor in my voice any longer. Something that can no longer be avoided or swept under the rug. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet as all eyes turned towards me, Ethan's expression becoming one of sudden concern. "Mom, is everything okay?" Through the swell of nausea, I focused every ounce of resolve on the woman beside him, the soulless, depraved harpy masquerading as his beloved wife. Clara tilted her head in faux curiosity, but I could see the faintest flicker of panic in those beady little eyes as their inevitability sank in. "No, Ethan, everything is not okay," I stated with cold finality. "For years now, your family has been suffering an infestation of lies and betrayal, and it's time that cancer was cut out for good." A hush draped over the room like a suffocating blanket as the implications slowly dawned on Clara. I caught Derek inching forward from the corner of my vision, boxing in his prey. "You see, your dear wife here hasn't been quite the faithful partner she's made herself out to be. In fact, that woman is nothing more than a manipulative liar and an accomplished con artist, one who's been actively cheating and orchestrating your personal, emotional, and financial ruin." The explosion was immediate, Clara bolting out of her chair with a strangled shriek of indignation. "How dare you make such vile, outrageous accusations?" She spat with turbocharged venom, whirling on my son. "Ethan, you can't possibly believe a word from these deranged liars. They're just bitter, jealous old harpies who can't stand to see us happy." But Ethan simply stared back in mute horror, his world crumbling beneath the weight of her visceral panic. When no denial or defense came from him, the terror in Clara's eyes reached a crescendo. Seizing the moment, Derek and Lena moved in with the laptop containing her recorded confessions, allowing the raw audio to blast through the room in high-definition clarity. Every despicable admission, every scheme to financially eviscerate Ethan and destroy this family's legacy poured forth in Clara's own gleefully narrated voice. As the look of realization congealed on my son's face, she switched tactics with desperate, grasping sobs. "Ethan, my love, you know I was just venting. Talking tough to make myself feel powerful in the face of adversity. You understand, don't you?" But even through her crocodile tears, the monster's fangs dripped with poison. With a contemptuous scoff, she redoubled her efforts at manipulation through attack. "This is all just one big, pathetic setup orchestrated by your shriveled old mother to turn you against me. She's bitter and alone, so she wants us to be as miserable as her, and—" The deafening crack of Ethan's palm across her cheek mercifully cut off her bile, leaving her lips sputtering and eyes bulging in shock. Clara raised a trembling hand to her reddened cheek as my son looked on her with a gaze of molten disgust. "Get out!" The words fell like grave weights from his lips. "But Ethan, my love, please, you can't mean—" "I said get out!" he roared with animalistic fury. "I'm alive purely because of these people, my family. But all you've done is try to defile that family with your greed and lies. You don't belong here among us anymore. You are alone now." I watched in stunned silence, my heart in splinters, as Clara's entire world collapsed around her like a grotesque imitation of a human being. Weeping and wailing her refusals, she was pulled bodily from our home, cut loose from the family's fabric like the gangrenous growth she was. And as the door slammed behind her sorry form, I finally had a chance to breathe again. The serpent had been severed from our brood, her venom finally defanged for good. In the aftermath of Clara's cataclysmic unmasking, the silence that blanketed our home was deafening. Like the uneasy calm after a tornado's passing, we were left to take stock of the upheaval and devastation left in its wake. Ethan retreated into a shell of mute shock and betrayal, unable to even look me in the eye. I couldn't begin to fathom the vortex of emotions swirling within him, the anguish of being so systematically deceived by the person he trusted most, the humiliation of being played for a fool, the rage at her depravity. Just watching his hollow stare was like bearing witness to a light slowly snuffing out. For several days he remained that way, a ghost drifting through these halls he once called home. Derek and Lena attempted to reach out to remind him he wasn't alone in his grief and anger, but the walls he'd erected to protect what fragments remained of his heart were impenetrable. For my part, I didn't dare force consolation on him too soon. As his mother, I understood this was a wound that would need time and space to begin healing properly. So I kept vigil, lingering nearby to let him know I was present, but never imposing. Just existing as a bastion of familial solidarity should he decide to lash out or crumble completely. Then, almost a week after that explosive confrontation, the other ongoing saga decided to rear its head once more. "Mrs. Harper?" The smarmy lilt of Clara's overpriced lawyer wormed its way through the phone line. "We need to discuss your client's grievous and libelous actions against my client. She's suffered great personal and professional humiliation at the hands of your slander, and we fully intend to pursue legal recourse." I rolled my eyes so hard I thought they might detach and go clattering across the kitchen floor. Even disgraced and excommunicated, that vile succubus still thought she could slither her way back through intimidation. "Save your posturing, you third-rate ambulance chaser," I sneered with more venom than I expected. "Your client is nothing more than a deceitful con artist who engaged in criminal fraud and infidelity against my family, all of which we have ample evidence to prove in court, I might add." There was a momentary pause as I allowed that truth to soak in. I could practically hear the hamster wheels spinning in the little weasel's mind. "Libel is still a very serious matter, Mrs. Harper," came the inevitable rebuttal in a tone much less assured. "My client will not take this lying down." "Then I warmly encourage her to pursue this case and fulfill her martyr complex," I interrupted, balling my free hand into a fist so tight I could feel the nails cutting crescents into my palm. "Because I can guarantee you the fallout of that deposition. The evidence will enter, the witness testimonies will compel, the sordid details that will be dragged out into the light of public record will reduce any remaining shreds of her credibility and reputation to ashes, unless she has a hankering for ending up completely destitute financially and socially." Whether it was the steel behind my words or the stark truth ringing in that miserable shyster's ears, the sputtering stopped abruptly. For a blessed few moments, there was only the delectable sound of their case's prospects crumbling to dust. "We'll be in touch," came the meek rejoinder before the line went dead. I let out a long, pent-up breath as the call disconnected. Just another toothless strike from a soon-to-be defunct adversary, forced to slink back into whatever rancid den she crawled out of. Still, it felt cathartic to be the one keeping the snakes at bay for once, the lioness fiercely guarding her bloodied pride's sanctuary. From the hallway behind me, I suddenly became aware of Ethan's presence hovering. Had he been there long, watching the display? I I turned slowly to find him fixated on me with an indecipherable gaze. "You weren't kidding," he said, his voice sounding almost childlike with disbelief. "When you said she was toxic and manipulative, when you vowed to cut that cord completely, you meant every single word." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words never came. Seeing the rawness carving canyons across his face, my throat grew inexplicably tight. Before I could regain my bearings, Ethan had crossed the distance between us and pulled me into a stranglingly fierce embrace. "Thank you," he rasped, as I felt hot tears spilling down the back of my neck. "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us. You never stopped fighting for this family, and I'll never forget that as long as I live." Heaving sobs racked my own body as I hugged him back with equal desperation, my lips murmuring every soothing reassurance a mother could muster between gasps for air. United in our grief and deliverance, the broken shards of our trust began reshaping into something resilient, something resolved to never be betrayed again. We would savor this moment for however long it was needed to be fully bathed in the absence of Clara's venom. Then, when the last drops were expelled, we could finally begin putting the pieces of our lives back together. The weeks following Clara's excision from our family were a hectic whirlwind. Between fielding the occasional toothless legal threat and orchestrating Ethan's divorce proceedings, there was little respite from the lingering drama she insisted on fomenting. But with Derek and Lena steadfastly by my side, we weathered each pathetic gambit and postured maneuver from that miserable snake, united as a bastion against her final, desperate tantrum throes. Through it all, I made a concerted effort to keep extending the same patience and understanding to Ethan that he had afforded me in the aftermath of my beloved Teddy's passing all those years ago. The grieving process after being so insidiously violated can feel interminable, the wounds reopening with every triggered memory or habitual reminder. There were times the waves of anger, sorrow, and sheer disillusionment threatened to drown him completely. I'd find him sitting in the dark, clutching old photographs or staring blankly ahead as the reality of his defilement washed over him anew. In those fragile moments, I'd simply hold his hand and softly reassure him it was okay to feel utterly destroyed for a while. No words could anesthetize the all-consuming anguish. It had to be fully experienced, cauterized with time until the flames of betrayal burned down to embers. I'd been through similar depths before in the wake of Teddy's death and could impart that hard-earned wisdom. It was the only torch to light Ethan's path back from the abyss. As the proceedings wrapped up and Clara was expunged from his life for good, I could sense my son's scarred spirit beginning to slowly mend. The once hollow gaze regained tiny flickers of life and resilience. Each day saw him engage more fully with the world, rediscovering those simple joys and passions that she had systematically leached away. It wasn't an easy journey by any stretch, and there were certainly setbacks and backslides along the way. Forgiveness would prove the longest hurdle, both for Clara's unforgivable sins and his own self-pardoning for being so blasely blind to them. But we pressed on as a united front, applying familial love and understanding as healing salves whenever the old wounds began to fester. Then, a little over a year after that awful night of deliverance, I caught a glimpse of the light finally piercing through the storm clouds. Derek, Lena, and I had come over to Ethan's place for a small family dinner, our presence no longer stiflingly overbearing. As we sat around the table chatting over heaping plates, my son suddenly raised his glass in our direction. Can I just take a moment to propose a toast?" His voice sounded stronger, more assured than it had in months. "To the 3 people who saved my life in more ways than I can properly articulate." He turned to Derek first, offering a respectful nod. "You were the strategist, the voice of cold, pragmatic reason when my whole world was crumbling. If not for your insights and careful planning, I might still be trapped under that vile woman's control, wasting away in oblivion." Derek accepted the praise with a humble dip of his head. Ethan's gaze then fell on Lena, shining with unmistakable reverence. "You were our secret weapon, the warrior princess who stared true evil right in the face without flinching. I'll never forget your bravery, your commitment to defending me, defending all of us, from that. He trailed off with a pained look before recovering, his features hardening. That a succubus like Clara was even allowed to smear her darkness across our family is a sin I'll spend lifetimes atoning for. But you were the light that cut through and banished her for good." Lena flushed under the weight of such admiration, flashing a reassuring smile. Finally, Ethan's eyes found their way to me, shimmering with a soulful depth that instantly reopened the cracks in my heart all over again. "And Mom, what can I possibly say to the one person who never stopped believing I was worth saving, even when the evil had corroded me down to my foundations?" I felt my throat grow thick as he reached across the table to grasp my hands in his calloused grip. "You fought for me, you clawed me back from the abyss of her manipulations with every last ounce of motherly fury. When everyone else had been so utterly deceived, you alone could still see my essence worth cherishing underneath all the toxicity. I'll never be able to properly repay that unwavering love and perseverance." Tears streamed freely down both our cheeks as mother and son embraced, allowing the roiling tsunami of love and regret, of deliverance and resilience, to crash over us in waves once more. In that moment, the last vestiges of Clara's blight were finally washed away by the restorative power of family. When we eventually pulled apart with weary smiles, I could see the man I had fought so fiercely to protect, shining through my son's eyes once more. Hardened by betrayal yet edified in spirit, ready to joyfully rejoin the world and have a fresh reckoning for the depravities lurking amidst the light. As the conversation resumed with laughter and fresh resilience, I caught Ethan watching me with a contented expression. A lifetime of adoration and hard-won wisdom passed between our shared gaze, the reconnected heartbeat of this clan united against any evil that dared to encroach. We were battered, slightly broken, but burning ever brighter, thanks to the cauterizing flames of last year's purgative inferno. Our family's sanctity had been violated in the worst way, but in the end, the sanctity emerged stronger through trial by fire. There was beauty in that resilience, that unyielding defiance against the darkness. And with it came a resolute sense of purpose moving forward, to fiercely protect the bonds of this family, this home, from ever being tainted or torn asunder again.